There is a voice most of us know intimately. It doesn't shout. It doesn't sound cruel, at least not at first. In fact, it often sounds reasonable, responsible, even noble. Do better. Don't make mistakes. You could have done more. You should be more disciplined, more focused, more perfect. And so we listen. We wake up with this voice. We carry it into our work, our relationships, our private moments. Even when no one is watching, it is there, measuring, comparing, correcting. We call this voice motivation. We call it self-improvement. Sometimes we even call it love for ourselves. But what if we are mistaken? What if, beneath this polished surface, something far more subtle is happening? What if this constant demand to be better is not kindness, but a quiet form of violence? Not violence in the obvious sense, no raised fists, no visible wounds. But a deeper, more intimate kind of violence. The refusal to allow ourselves to be as we are. Look closely. Every time the mind says, "This is not good enough," it is not just evaluating, it is rejecting. Every time it insists, "I must fix this, improve that, eliminate this flaw," it is not just guiding, it is attacking. And over time, this becomes a habit so deeply ingrained that we no longer question it. We assume this is simply what it means to be human. To be a project. To be unfinished. To be fundamentally flawed. But here is the turning point, the question that quietly disrupts everything. Who is this self that must be perfected? We rarely stop to ask this. We assume there is a solid, me, at the center of all this effort. A fixed identity that is somehow broken, incomplete, and in need of constant repair. A me that must be improved. A me that must be protected from failure. A me that must eventually become worthy. And so, perfectionism begins to make sense. If there truly is a fixed self, defective, lacking, not yet enough, then of course we must work on it, refine it, polish it endlessly. But what if this assumption is never questioned? What if the very foundation of this entire struggle is an illusion? Because if there is no solid, unchanging self to begin with, if what we call I is not a fixed entity but something fluid, shifting, and dependently arising, then what exactly are we trying to perfect? This is where something radical begins to emerge. Because the problem may not be that we are imperfect. The problem may be that we believe there is a self that should be perfect. And from that belief, an entire structure of tension is built. Striving without rest. Comparing without end. Correcting without compassion. This is the hidden violence of perfectionism. Not the desire to grow, growth is natural. Not the intention to learn, learning is part of being alive. But the relationship we form with ourselves in that process. A relationship based not on understanding, but on control. Not on curiosity, but on judgment. Not on gentleness, but on pressure. And the cost is subtle, but immense. We become afraid of our own mistakes. We hide parts of ourselves that don't fit the ideal. We turn our inner life into a battlefield, where one part of the mind is constantly trying to fix, suppress, or eliminate another. All in the name of becoming better. But better for whom? Better according to what? And again, the question returns, more quietly now, but more powerfully. Who is this self at the center of it all? If we follow this question deeply, not intellectually, but experientially, we begin to see cracks in the assumption we've carried for so long. And through those cracks, something unexpected begins to appear. A possibility that we have been relating to ourselves in a fundamentally mistaken way. A possibility that the struggle to perfect ourselves may be built on a misunderstanding of what we are. And if that is true, then perhaps the solution is not to try harder, but to see more clearly. And this is where we begin to turn away from the endless project of self-perfection and toward a radically different way of understanding the mind. A way that has been explored deeply in Buddhist thought, through a simple but profoundly unsettling insight. There is no permanent self to perfect. This insight is known as Anattā, non-self, and as we begin to explore it, we may discover that what we thought was discipline was actually tension. What we thought was self-improvement was actually self-rejection. And what we thought was strength was, in many ways, a quiet refusal to be at peace. But if the foundation itself begins to dissolve, if the self we are trying to fix is not what we think it is, then something else becomes possible. Not perfection, but something far more radical, something far more human. Something we will begin to uncover next. A different way of relating to experience. Not through control, but through understanding. Not through force, but through gentleness. Let us return to the question we left hanging, quiet, but deeply unsettling. Who is this self that must be perfected? At first, the answer seems obvious. It's me, the one who thinks, the one who feels, the one who remembers the past and plans for the future. The one who is trying, struggling, improving. It feels undeniable, immediate, real. But now, instead of answering quickly, let us slow down and look more carefully. Right now, this very moment, what do you actually experience? Not what you believe you are, not what you've been told, but what is directly here. There are thoughts, appearing, disappearing. There are sensations in the body, pressure, warmth, movement. There are emotions, subtle or strong, shifting, changing. There are perceptions, sounds, colors, shapes. And if you observe closely, something becomes undeniable. Everything you can notice is changing. A thought arises, and it's gone. A feeling comes, and it fades. Even the sense of I, the feeling of being someone, appears and disappears depending on conditions. So we ask again, more precisely this time. Which of these is the self? Is it the thoughts? But thoughts come and go, often without permission. Is it the body? But the body is constantly changing, cell by cell, moment by moment. Is it emotions? But emotions shift like weather, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, never fixed. Or is it the story we tell ourselves? The narrative of who I am. But even that story changes. Who you believed you were 5 years ago is not who you believe you are today. Your preferences, your fears, your identity, they evolve. And yet, despite all this change, there is a persistent feeling. I am still me. So what is this? Me. This is where the insight of Anattā begins to open, not as a belief, but as an observation. Anattā does not say, you do not exist. It says something far more subtle. There is no fixed, unchanging, independent entity behind experience. What we call self is not a solid thing. It is a process, a flow, a dynamic pattern of thoughts, sensations, memories, and reactions, constantly arising due to causes and conditions. Like a river. We give it a name, the river. But there is no single, permanent substance that is the river. It is movement. It is change. And in the same way, what we call I is a convenient label, a useful way of speaking. But when we look directly, we cannot find a fixed core that stays the same. Only experiences unfolding. Now pause here. Because this insight is not just philosophical. It has profound implications for how we relate to ourselves. Because if there is no fixed self, then what exactly is perfectionism trying to fix? Perfectionism assumes there is a stable identity. A me that is flawed, insufficient, not yet complete. And it builds an entire system around this assumption. I must improve myself. I must eliminate my weaknesses. I must become better. But if the self is not a fixed object, If it is not something solid that can be repaired like a broken machine, then this entire project begins to lose its foundation. Because what is being perfected? A thought? A passing emotion? A temporary state? You cannot perfect something that is constantly changing. You can only try to control it. And that is exactly what perfectionism becomes. An attempt to control a process that cannot be controlled in the way we imagine. To freeze what is fluid. To stabilize what is inherently unstable. To define what is constantly evolving. And this is why it creates tension. Because reality does not cooperate with this illusion. Life continues to move. The mind continues to change. Experiences continue to arise and pass. And yet the belief in a fixed self persists. Quietly, stubbornly. Creating the feeling that something is always off. Something is always not quite right. Something must still be fixed. But what if nothing is fundamentally wrong? What if the discomfort does not come from being imperfect, but from trying to hold on to something that was never solid to begin with? This is the beginning of a shift. Not a shift in what we are, but a shift in how we see. Instead of asking, how can I perfect myself? We begin to ask, what is this self I am trying to perfect? And as we look, gently, patiently, the answer becomes less clear. And strangely, that lack of clarity is not a problem. It is an opening. Because when the idea of a fixed self begins to soften, something else softens with it. The pressure. The constant need to improve. But be careful with this word. Because at first, the mind may misunderstand it. Gentleness is often associated with weakness, with passivity, with letting things slide. It may sound like giving up, like lowering standards, like becoming indifferent. But radical gentleness is none of these things. It is not laziness. It is not avoidance. It is not the absence of clarity. In fact, it requires more awareness, not less. More honesty, not less. More courage, not less. Because radical gentleness is not about changing what is happening. It is about changing how we relate to what is happening. Right now, in your direct experience, a thought appears. I'm not good enough. The usual reaction, the conditioned one, is immediate. Reject it. Fight it. Replace it. Fix it. Or worse, believe it completely and collapse into it. But what if, instead of reacting, we simply notice? The thought arises. It stays for a moment. And it passes. No need to suppress it. No need to analyze it. No need to identify with it. Just seeing. Just allowing. This is gentleness. Not as a strategy, but as a natural response when there is no fixed self to defend. Because if there is no solid me at the center, then that thought, I'm not good enough, is not a verdict about who you are. It is just a mental event, arising due to causes, passing due to conditions. And in that seeing, something profound shifts. The relationship changes. Instead of, I must fix myself, there is, this is what is arising right now. Instead of, this should not be happening. There is, this is happening. And that may sound simple, almost too simple. But it is deeply radical. Because it goes against everything we have been conditioned to do. We have been taught to control, to correct, to improve. To treat the mind like a machine that must be optimized. But radical gentleness says, what if nothing needs to be forced? What if understanding is more transformative than control? What if clarity arises not through pressure, but through allowing things to be seen as they are? This is where gentleness becomes revolutionary. Because it dismantles the very structure of perfectionism. Perfectionism says, you must become something else. Gentleness says, let's understand what is already here. Perfectionism creates tension between what is and what should be. Gentleness dissolves that tension, not by changing reality, but by removing the resistance to it. And something surprising happens when resistance drops. Clarity increases. Not because we try harder, but because we are no longer distorting experience through judgment. When you are no longer fighting a feeling, you can actually feel it fully. When you are no longer rejecting a thought, you can see it clearly. And when something is clearly seen, it begins to lose its power, not through force, but through understanding. This is the paradox. Gentleness does not make us passive. It makes us precise. It allows us to see the mechanics of the mind, how thoughts arise, how emotions form, how reactions are triggered. And in that seeing, change happens. But not the kind of change driven by self-rejection. A different kind. A natural unfolding. Like a knot that loosens, not because you pull harder, but because you stop tightening it. And this is why radical gentleness is deeply aligned with the insight of non-self. Because when there is no fixed identity to protect or perfect, there is no need for aggression. No need to force experience into a particular shape. Only a quiet, attentive presence that allows things to arise and pass. This does not mean we stop growing. It means growth is no longer driven by fear. It is no longer fueled by the belief that we are not enough. Instead, growth becomes an expression of understanding, a natural movement, not a forced correction. And yet, even as this begins to make sense, even as something in us resonates with this gentler way, another part resists. A voice may say, "If I stop pushing myself, I'll become lazy. If I'm too gentle, I'll lose control. If I don't fix myself, nothing will change." This resistance is not a mistake. It is part of the process. Because the structure we call ego, this sense of being a separate, controlling self, does not dissolve easily. It clings. It defends. It insists on its role as the one who must manage, improve, and direct everything. And so, as gentleness begins to emerge, so does fear. Fear of letting go. Fear of not being in control. Fear of what remains if the self is no longer at the center. And this is where the journey deepens. Because to truly understand radical gentleness, we must also understand this resistance. Not fight it. Not eliminate it. But see it clearly for what it is. And that is what we will begin to explore next. The resistance of the ego, and why letting go feels so threatening. As radical gentleness begins to reveal itself, quietly, subtly, something else begins to rise in the background. Not clarity, not peace, but resistance. A tightening. A subtle voice that says, "This is dangerous. This won't work. You can't just let go like that." And if you listen closely, this voice carries a certain urgency. Almost as if something important is at stake. And in a way, it is. Because what is being questioned here is not just a habit. Not just a mindset. It is the very structure of what we take ourselves to be. The sense of being someone. A central figure who must manage life, control outcomes, and become better over time. This is what we commonly call the ego. But let's be precise. The ego is not a thing. It is not an entity hiding somewhere inside you. It is a pattern. A pattern of identification. A pattern of believing that there is a me at the center of experience. A me who owns thoughts, controls actions, and is responsible for becoming something. And this pattern has been reinforced for years. Through culture. Through education. Through language itself. I am this. I am that. I should be better. I must improve. So when radical gentleness begins to loosen this structure, when it suggests that maybe there is no fixed self to control everything, the system reacts, not because something is wrong, but because something familiar is being challenged. And the ego, in its essence, is built on familiarity, on continuity, on the sense that I am the one in charge. So when that sense begins to weaken, even slightly, it can feel unsettling, even threatening. Because if there is no central controller, then who is running the show? If there is no fixed identity, then who am I? And beneath these questions, there is often a deeper, quieter fear. If I stop striving, will I become nothing? This is the hidden fear behind perfectionism. Not just the fear of failure, but the fear of disappearing. The fear that without constant effort, constant self-definition, there will be emptiness, meaninglessness, a kind of inner void. And so, the ego clings. It says, keep improving, keep controlling, don't let go. Because from its perspective, letting go feels like losing everything. But here is the paradox. What we are afraid of losing was never solid to begin with. This self we are trying to preserve, this image, this identity, this sense of being a fixed someone, is itself a construction. A collection of memories, beliefs, and habitual patterns, constantly changing, constantly being updated. And yet, we treat it as something real, something stable, something that must be protected. This is where the tension comes from. Because reality does not support this illusion. Experience continues to flow. Thoughts arise without being commanded. Emotions shift without asking permission. Life unfolds in ways we cannot fully control. And yet the ego insists, I should be in charge of this. So it tries harder. It tightens its grip. It becomes more rigid, more demanding. And this is where perfectionism intensifies. Not because we are strong, but because we are afraid. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of being seen as flawed. Afraid of losing the sense of control. But if we look closely, gently, without judgment, we begin to see something remarkable. The one who is trying to control is itself just another experience. A thought that says, I must fix this. A feeling of tension in the body. A sense of urgency. All of it, arising, passing, just like everything else. So we ask a different question now. Not, how do I let go of the ego? But, what is this ego made of right now? And when we look, not conceptually, but directly, we don't find a solid controller. We find thoughts, sensations, emotions, all moving, all changing. There is no central authority behind them, only the appearance of one. And this is the turning point. Because when it is clearly seen that the controller is not actually in control, that it is just another pattern arising within experience, then something begins to relax. Not because we force it to, but because the illusion is no longer fully believed. And in that moment, letting go no longer feels like a loss. It feels like a release. A release from the constant effort of trying to be someone. A release from the pressure of having to hold everything together. A release from the endless project of self-perfection. And what remains is not emptiness in the way we feared. It is openness. A kind of spaciousness where experience can unfold without being forced into a rigid identity. But this does not mean the resistance disappears completely. It may still arise. The voice may still return. You should be doing more. You're falling behind. This isn't enough. But now, something is different. We don't have to believe it. We don't have to obey it. We can see it for what it is. Another movement of the mind. Another pattern. Not a command. Not a truth. And in that seeing, the grip loosens. Not through effort, but through understanding. This is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom from experience, but freedom from being entangled in the illusion of a fixed self that must control everything. And from here, a new way of living becomes possible. Not driven by fear. Not guided by perfectionism, but grounded in clarity, in awareness, in a quiet, steady presence that does not need to become anything else. And this brings us to the final step of this exploration, a way of living that is no longer burdened by the need to perfect a self, because it has seen deeply and directly that there is no such self to begin with. Let us now turn to what that life looks like. So after all of this, after questioning the self, after seeing through the illusion of something solid to fix, after recognizing the quiet aggression of perfectionism and the resistance of the ego, a new question naturally arises. If there is no self to perfect, then how do we live? Do we stop growing? Do we stop caring? Do we become passive, indifferent, detached from life? Or is there another way? A way that is not built on pressure, but on clarity. Let us look carefully. Because what falls away is not intelligence, not responsiveness, not the natural movement toward learning and refinement. What falls away is the burden, the psychological weight of believing, I must become something else in order to be okay. And when that burden begins to dissolve, something unexpected appears. A sense of lightness. Not because life becomes easy, but because we are no longer fighting ourselves within it. Mistakes still happen. You say the wrong thing. You miss an opportunity. You fall short of your own expectations. But now, instead of immediately turning those moments into evidence of a flawed identity, something different happens. There is space. The mistake is seen, but it is not turned into me. It is just what happened. A moment in a flow of moments. And from that space, a different kind of intelligence begins to function. Not the intelligence of fear, which says, fix this quickly so you won't be judged. But the intelligence of understanding, which asks, what actually happened here? And in that question, there is no violence. Only curiosity. Only clarity. This is what it means to live without the burden of perfection. You are still fully engaged with life, but not entangled in a constant narrative about who you are. Emotions still arise. Frustration, sadness, even self-doubt. But they are no longer enemies. They are experiences. They move through awareness like weather across the sky. And because they are not resisted, they do not linger in the same way. They are felt, and they pass. Thoughts still come. The inner critic may still speak. You should have done better. This isn't enough. You're not where you should be. But now, these thoughts are seen as thoughts, not commands, not truths, not definitions of self. And in that seeing, something quietly transforms. The voice loses its authority, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer believed in the same way. This is freedom. Not the freedom of controlling everything, but the freedom of not being controlled by every thought, every reaction, every impulse to fix. And from this freedom, action still happens. You still learn. You still grow. You still refine your skills, your relationships, your understanding. But the energy behind it is different. It is not driven by the fear of not being enough. It is not fueled by the need to prove something. It arises naturally, out of clarity, out of interest, out of a direct relationship with what is happening. And this kind of growth is sustainable, because it is not based on tension. It is based on alignment with reality. You begin to move with life, rather than constantly trying to reshape yourself against it. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to relate to yourself in a completely different way. Not as a problem to be solved, not as a project to be completed, but as a living, unfolding process. There is nothing static to fix, nothing permanent to perfect. Only experience, arising and passing, moment by moment. And in that realization, something deeply human becomes available again. A quiet sense of ease. A permission to be imperfect. Not as an excuse, but as a reflection of how life actually is. Imperfect. Changing. Unfinished. and yet completely alive. This does not mean we stop caring. It means we care without aggression. We engage without self-rejection. We act without the constant shadow of not enough. And this is where radical gentleness reveals its full depth. It is not just a way of relating to thoughts or emotions. It is a way of being in the world. A way of walking, speaking, working, and relating, without carrying the invisible weight of needing to be someone else. And from here, something very simple, but very profound, becomes clear. You were never a problem to be solved. You were never a fixed self in need of perfection. What you are is a process, a dynamic unfolding of conditions, experiences, and awareness. And when this is seen, not as an idea, but as a direct truth, the struggle begins to fade. Not because life is control, but because the illusion of a controller is no longer at the center. And in its place, there is something quieter, more open, more real. A life that is not about becoming perfect, but about seeing clearly. And in that clarity, there is a kind of peace that does not need to be earned. A kind of freedom that does not depend on becoming anything else. Just this, as it is, unfolding. The quiet aggression we direct toward ourselves. And in that softening, a new possibility begins to emerge. A way of relating to experience that is not based on fixing or controlling, but on understanding. Not on judgment, but on something far more radical. Something that does not arise from the illusion of a self, but from seeing through it. A quality that we will now begin to explore, now. As the idea of a solid self begins to loosen. As we start to see that what we are is not a fixed entity, but a living, changing process. Something unexpected begins to happen. The pressure softens. Not because we decide to be kinder to ourselves. Not because we adopt a new belief or repeat a positive affirmation. But because the very thing we were trying to control is no longer seen as something solid. And in that space, a new way of relating naturally begins to emerge. We can call it